Welcome to our Bible study for this week, continuing, of course, in our Cumberland Presbyterian encounter material, and we are seeking the ever-present Christ in Old Testament passages, and yet today we're almost going to do the reverse, because as soon as I read this passage you are going to already see Christ, and I want us to back up a minute and see what the original hearers or readers would have heard or read, and then we will look for Christ. But if you have ever celebrated Christmas in any church, almost anywhere in the world, you will immediately see Christ in this passage. It is from Isaiah, the 9th chapter, verses 1 through 7. Hear now the word from the Lord. But there will be no gloom for those who were in anguish. In the former time he brought into contempt the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, but in the latter time he will make glorious the way of the sea, the land beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the nations. The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Those who lived in a land of deep darkness, on them light has shined. You have multiplied the nation. You have increased its joy. They rejoice with you, they rejoice before you as with joy at the harvest, as people exult when dividing plunder. For the yoke of their burden and the bar across their shoulders, the rod of their oppressor you have broken as on the day of Midian. For all the boots of the tramping warriors and all the garments rolled in blood shall be burned in fire as fuel. For a child has been born to us, a son has been given to us. Authority rests upon his shoulders, and he is named Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. His authority shall grow continually, and there shall be endless peace for the throne of David and his kingdom. He will establish and uphold it with justice and with righteousness, from this time onward and forevermore. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this. And you may even have Handel's Messiah playing in your head as you hear that, and we will get to that towards the end. But I want us to, as I mentioned, first think about what the original hearers would have heard. And the truth of the matter is that most of the prophecies in the Old Testament that we see as prophecies of Christ are prophecies of Christ, but they actually were prophecies for the present time when the prophet was working, as well as for the far off time. Two things can be simultaneously true, and oftentimes whoever the prophet is talking about, the prophet is talking about a contemporary figure as well as Jesus. A great example is Messiah. Jesus is obviously the Messiah, with a capital T. But oftentimes in the Old Testament, when the talk is of a Messiah, it's anyone who saves the Jewish people, including even Cyrus the Persian, who allowed the exiles to go home. He is called a Messiah, a Gentile king. He's not the Messiah, but he is a Messiah, and he is in there, and some of the passages that we read talking about Jesus as the Messiah are also talking about Cyrus. A few weeks ago, our truck broke down right in the middle of I-40 in Knoxville. Lee was driving it. I wasn't there with her that day, and she was able to get at the side of the road, and one of those folks from the Department of Transportation in one of those yellow help trucks showed up, and he really helped her and made sure she had everything she needed and that she was safe and that kind of thing. And I don't think she did this, but she could have said to him, "Oh, sir, you are my saving grace." Now, she wasn't saying to him, "Oh, sir, you are Jesus." But she was saying, in a sense, and again, this wouldn't have been a conscious kind of thing, but you are like Jesus, because in my time of need, you came and you appeared in the flesh and you were with me and you gave me what I needed to be helped. And so that's actually what's going on here in Isaiah. And let me explain a little bit about how that happened and what is going on here. We've got a good friend named Wayne Patterson, and his father grew up during the Great Depression. And I need to mention that Wayne Patterson is a Republican, and it's important to me to tell you that because I'm not trying to make some kind of political announcement here or pronouncement here. I'm just trying to make a point. And knowing that Wayne is a Republican, I think will hopefully help you know that, because his father always said to him, "Wayne, always vote for a Democrat. We voted for a Republican once, and we nearly starved." And what his father was saying, of course, was Hoover didn't do us any good, but then Roosevelt came along, and we were able to get out of the Great Depression. But the idea that his father was giving to Wayne is kind of what is going on in this passage. Because when Isaiah is ministering here, and actually you should know, if you don't already know, that there are 3 or maybe even 4 different Isaiahs in the book of Isaiah. The ministry of Isaiah spanned more than 200 years. But at this point in the book, early in the book, Isaiah would have been ministering under the reign of King Ahaz. And that is not to be confused with King Ahab, whom we met a few weeks ago with Elijah, but rather King Ahaz. And King Ahaz was a terribly wicked king. This is around 700 years before Jesus is born, and Ahaz is tempted to go after foreign gods, false gods. And among his many crimes, one of the things he did was he sacrificed one of his sons to the prophet Baal. And the way that children were sacrificed to Baal was they were burned alive on an altar as a sacrifice to Baal. And Ahaz did that. And if that wasn't bad enough, he did all other sorts of things, like he had a replica of an altar from Damascus erected probably up on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, had the big altar in Jerusalem on the Temple Mount moved, and he said, well, I'll use that altar when I need to for consultation. But he was much more interested in those false gods and the false altars. He desecrated the temple by removing that porch. We saw the temple the other week. They had that big porch and the big great cedars that were in front of the porch. He had that removed. He ended up destroying the furnishings in the temple, just chopping them all up to pieces. And eventually he nailed the doors to the temple shut and wouldn't let anybody into the temple. He erected altars throughout Jerusalem and throughout all the towns in Judah. And he was king of Judah. The kingdom was already split at that point. And enticed all of the people to worship other idols. And they were tempted because their leader tempted them, and they succumbed. And as a part of this, God allowed the Assyrians to come in and sack much of their land. By the end of Ahaz's reign, there was almost nothing but Jerusalem left still standing. So many of the people had been killed or taken off in exile, and so many of the cities had been plundered by the Assyrians. But during the reign of Ahaz fathers a son. He actually fathered a number of sons. One of his sons died fighting the Assyrians. But he fathers a son he names Hezekiah. And you may know that name. You may remember the title, Good King Hezekiah. And in spite of the fact that his father was wicked, Hezekiah was a good king and a wonderful king for Israel. Ahaz ruled for about 20 years. He ruled for 4 years with his father, and then for 16 years he ruled by himself. And then Hezekiah comes to the throne. But when Hezekiah is born, that is what Isaiah is writing about when he says, "For to us a child is born, and a son has been given, and he is going to be a mighty, a wonderful counselor, mighty God, everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. He is going to be one who will rule with righteousness and with justice." And we remember those words from last week from Amos. And those titles that Hezekiah has, first, of course, Isaiah is giving him those titles right at his birth. And obviously, at that moment, he's not a wonderful counselor or any of those other things. And even as he is a king, hopefully he was a wonderful counselor, but he wasn't a mighty God or everlasting Father or Prince of Peace. John Goldingay, the theologian and biblical scholar, says that he was really kind of almost holding those titles for Jesus, but he also was going to model those titles a little bit. Not that he would rule as if he were mighty God, as if he were all powerful, but he would rule as a servant of the mighty God, and a servant of the everlasting Father, and a servant of the Prince of Peace. And so as soon as he comes into his reign, he begins to do so many really good things. And so Isaiah is prophesying that even here at his birth, the light is already dawning. If you've ever been backpacking or camping out and you're in the tent and it's dark and there's all these strange noises, when it just starts to get light, and it's not light yet, but the light is just starting, the sun hasn't come up yet, but you can start seeing it, it almost feels safer and more secure, because you know kind of the night is ending. And I've spent a few rather sleepless nights in tents way out backpacking when I was hearing weird noises around me and whatnot. But that light, when that light begins to dawn, already I'm feeling better. And Isaiah is saying to the people, already the light is dawning on you. And you've been walking in darkness, and you've been in all of this darkness, but now the light is dawning, and it's going to be for you great joy, like the joy at harvest, like the joy when a wedding comes. This is the joy that you are going to experience. And already they can experience it at Hezekiah's birth. But of course, he had to grow up and begin his reign. He did begin his reign when he was about 25 years old. And as I mentioned, he reigned for about 29 years. And although he wasn't perfect, he was a good and a wonderful king. And even at the relatively young age of 25, he began as a strong and wonderful leader. He pulled down all of the altars and all of the idols and all of the temples that his father had erected for false gods and for false idols. They were all removed immediately when he took the throne. He opened the temple back up again and allowed people to worship there again. He reestablished the Levites as the priestly caste and had them begin again to do their duties as priests of God. And I think so powerfully in many ways, he reestablished the Passover celebration. Once a year they would remember God's mighty deeds in Egypt, bringing the people out of slavery, and remember God's mighty deeds even to that day. Isaiah tells him that because he is good and faithful, that the Assyrians will never take Jerusalem while he is the king. And sure enough, they don't. And at one point, they show up at Jerusalem's gates, and they are ready to sack Jerusalem. And Isaiah says, don't worry. God will provide. God will defend you. And a terrible disease runs through the Assyrian army. And those who don't die are so afraid that they get up and they flee and run all the way back home. And Jerusalem is saved really without even having to fire a single shot. Not that they were firing guns at that time, but for loosing an arrow or engaging in defense in any other ways. Now, as I mentioned, he wasn't perfect, and at one point he made the mistake of showing an Assyrian ambassador all of the gold and silver and all of the wonderful furnishings in the temple, and it's really set the stage for after his death, when his son, who unfortunately was also a wicked king like Ahaz had been, when his son took the throne, the Assyrians came back and they sacked Jerusalem, and in 586 they destroyed the temple and began that great and terrible exile that we read about so often in the Bible. But I also want to, before we leave Hezekiah and move into Jesus, and I want to note how, because Hezekiah was faithful, God blessed him. Hezekiah had to do some very difficult things, but Hezekiah learned, whether it was good times or bad, whether the Assyrians were right outside the gates of Jerusalem, or whether Hezekiah were able to expand the territory somewhat, and he did, God was with him, and God cared for him because of his faithfulness. He was rewarded. But before we move on, I want us to think a little bit about the people, though. So often I think we tend to focus on leaders and maybe give too much credit and also too much blame to leaders. I find it interesting that Isaiah says the people who have walked in darkness. Now, if I am walking in darkness, it may be that I don't know where the light is and I can't find the light. But in fact, they knew where the light was. The light is the light of God. And if they walk in God's way, they're walking in the light. So there's a sense in which the people, tempted absolutely by Ahaz, tempted by others, succumbed to that temptation. But the idea of walking in darkness is the sense I get here that Isaiah is saying, you people bear some responsibility for this. And the verb there in the Hebrew is the verb to walk, to be moving. Later in Matthew 4, when Matthew has John testifying about Jesus, and he says, because Jesus began in the northern part, which is in Naphtali, where in Zebulun, where this passage in Isaiah begins. When Matthew quotes this passage, he says the people who have sat in darkness. And I also get the sense that even sitting in darkness, and the Greek there is also the word for sit. I get the sense that I can choose to sit in darkness, or I can choose to get up off of my rear, if you will, and walk not in darkness, but walk toward the light. And so we have this warning here, I think, for all of us to be aware. It's so easy to blame our leaders. How quickly we're seeing this college football season. College football coaches left and right are getting fired mid-season, and they're saying it's all your fault that we're not doing well. And granted, in many of the cases, maybe all of the cases, the criticism is correct, but it isn't all the coach's fault. We see it in politicians as well. We blame politicians for everything that goes wrong, and the blame may be well justified, but it isn't completely justified. We're going along with them as well. And we see it happening with pastors, I think, sometimes, and with other leaders as well. And the truth of the matter is that leaders bear a great responsibility, but also all of us bear a responsibility as well. My father-in-law was a wonderful businessman, and he used to say that businesses tend to get the employees they deserve. If the managers are good and the business treats their employees well, they're going to get good employees. If it's the opposite, then the opposite will happen. And I wonder if it's not also the case that sports teams and nations and churches and other groups tend to get the servant leaders that they deserve as well. The people, in one way or another, empowered Ahaz, and they allowed Ahaz to do the things. Ahaz wasn't all by himself building all of those temples and idols and altars. The people were doing it with him. And I think we need to pay attention to that and be aware that we bear individual and corporate responsibility as well as do our leaders. But the message of Isaiah is that through both Hezekiah, who holds the titles for Jesus and in a sense acts in Christ-like ways, and then Jesus, who doesn't simply hold the title but actually embodies the title. So here is where King Cyrus becomes Messiah, but Jesus is the Messiah. And Hezekiah is like a mighty God and like the Prince of Peace and like an everlasting Father, but Jesus is the mighty God, the everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace, the wonderful Counselor. And we see Isaiah then saying Jesus comes and does those things as well. And yet we also recognize that even though Jesus has come and Jesus is with us now, we recognize that there is still work to be done. And we still have to, not like those people of old did, walk in darkness, but walk towards the light and walk in the light and be bearers of the light. As a matter of fact, Jesus says that through him we are the light of the world. And so if the people who right now are walking in darkness or sitting in darkness are to see the light of Jesus, the light of Christ, then we have to be the light of Christ. And we have to do that, of course, through the love and the grace that Christ offers to us. We will be ending in the sermon on Sunday, our look at the Sermon on the Mount that we've been in for a little over 3 months. And in this sermon, Jesus ends with this wonderful invitation that we can build our houses on the sand, and that would be the shifting sands of whatever's going on politically out there, or the shifting sands of public opinion, or the shifting sands of whatever idle or easy way we can take can be, or we can build our lives, Jesus says, on the rock of his words, the words in the Sermon on the Mount. Do unto others as you would have them do unto me, which is kind of the ultimate phrase in that whole sermon, as we learned last week. If we do that, build upon that rock, then no storm or any problem can overwhelm us, because Christ will always be with us and we will always be there in the light. Well, I want to end this message or this Bible study kind of where we began. I mentioned Handel's Messiah, and that is just the soundtrack to Isaiah 9. And I think it's just a wonderful example of how, if you think about people who are sitting in darkness, people who have been going through terrible, terrible times, some of it self-imposed, but terrible times nonetheless, now are seeing the light and realizing the light is dawning and how beautiful and wonderful that is. Handel just captures that. And so I want you to hear now and see now this performance of For Unto Us a Child is Born from Handel. This is from the Warsaw Philharmonic Orchestra and the choir. The conductor is Martel Hasselbach. And this was recorded in December of 2018. And so here is For Unto Us a Child is Born. Indeed, we celebrate with Handel, we celebrate with the people of old, and we celebrate this day that Christ is with us. We celebrate that wonderful other title of Christ given to Christ by Isaiah earlier in the book of Isaiah, that Christ is Emmanuel, God with us. Amen.